the summer of 1832, a county clerk in Appalachia bent over a brittle ledger and wrote down a marriage bond that should never have existed. The names were the same, brother and sister bound by law, their signatures nearly indistinguishable. From that moment, the record began to repeat itself. Baptism after baptism, 47 children entered into parish rolls under the same parents, their faces echoing one another until individuality collapsed into pattern. By the 1870s, the family had become a village unto itself, the schoolhouse filled with children who spoke in unison, a census taker left with a headache and a note in his pocket. Same eyes, same hand. A traveling doctor wrote only 2 words, familial tendency, and when neighbors tried to intervene, their petition returned unopened, stamped, improper jurisdiction. By 1900, Hollow Ridge was gone. The census called it vacant. The house was burned. No stones mark the graves. What remains are fragments, photographs that flattened faces, ledgers with names crossed out, and a folder hidden in a clerk's drawer, its contents matching rumor more than history. Tonight, we open those pages again. We ask what happens when a family closes itself so tightly that time itself cannot tell them apart. Where are you watching from? Share your country and your time below, and step with us into the archive. Because some histories are not forgotten, they are erased. The record begins the way so many do in the 1830s. A folded bond, an inked line across brittle parchment, the clerk's quill scratching steadily in a courthouse that smelled of dust and lamp oil. It was July of 1832 when the marriage was set down. Nothing about the date suggested irregularity until the names were read aloud. Both carried the same surname. No guardianship was listed, no parental consent attached. Instead, there was silence, a blank space on the line where some acknowledgement of kinship might have been expected. Marriage bonds in that decade were usually filled with flourishes, the clerk taking pride in elegant script. Here the handwriting is steady but tight, as if the letters were kept under control. The banns, which should have been posted on the church door in advance, were not. No witnesses from outside the family are named. Only 2 signatures appear at the bottom, one above the other, their curves nearly identical. In the margin, the clerk added 2 words not required by form, family arrangement. It is a phrase that explains nothing, and yet tells more than silence could. The ledger itself survives with its edges crumbling, the ink browned by time. The page is thin enough to show faint bleed-through from earlier entries. Ordinary unions between farm laborers, field hands, mill workers. Those bonds name fathers, mothers, dowries, occupations. They place the couple within a web of social fabric. By contrast, this bond collapses inward. 2 names mirror each other across the line. No family is acknowledged because the family is the marriage. It was common for clerks to record guardianship when a bride was underage or when consent was necessary. Here the line remains untouched, though both parties were of age. The omission is not an oversight, but a choice, an act of filing what should not have been permitted. Bureaucracy has no voice for objection. Its only power is to inscribe. What strikes modern eyes are the signatures themselves. Each is written with the same looping hand, the same pressure, as though learned from the same desk, the same teacher, or copied in the same house. Scholars who later examined the page debated whether the 2 hands belonged to separate people at all. The ink is consistent, the letters aligned in near-perfect symmetry, yet the clerk accepted them as valid, pressed the seal, and closed the book. The practice of posting bans, a requirement meant to alert the community and allow objections, was bypassed. No one recalls seeing the names tacked to the church door. The silence is conspicuous. No minister's objection, no parishioner's protest. In a region where kin lived close and bloodlines often folded back on themselves, what might have been scandalous elsewhere was quietly absorbed. The bond was filed in the same drawer as all others. The courthouse still holds the ledger. Its spine has split, and the pages give a faint sigh when turned. The clerk's ink blot in the corner of the page remains, a dark spot where the quill paused too long. Beside it, the marginal note survives. 2 words balanced at an angle, written quickly, perhaps with unease, family arrangement. From that phrase, the rest unfolds. Children would come, not once or twice, but dozens of times, until the family no longer appeared as branches spreading outward, but as a single loop repeating itself. Yet here, at the origin, the record does not protest. It simply writes the union down, presses the seal, and leaves the question unasked. If a marriage never leaves the family, where do its children belong on the page? The parish registers of the 1830s are fragile things, ink browned by damp, edges softened by years of being turned with candle-warmed fingers. In their columns one begins to see a pattern too neat to be mistaken for chance. It begins with a single christening, then another and another, all under the same pair of names. Each year adds a line, each line a child, until the sequence becomes its own rhythm, like the toll of a bell that no one dares to silence. The names of the mother and father are repeated with unwavering regularity. In the space reserved for godparents, which should have introduced variety, only cousins appear. Cousins by blood, cousins by fence line, names that never leave the loop of the homestead. No tradesmen, no neighbors from further afield, no outsiders from the village. What should have been a web of connections shrinks instead into a circle drawn tighter with every baptismal entry. The initials of the midwife recur as well, appearing beside each line like a watermark. She records herself only with 2 letters, perhaps for modesty, perhaps for self-preservation. Her hand appears year after year, as steady as the priest's. She alone seems to witness the cadence of births that others in the parish will not name aloud. When asked later, parishioners would recall only that she was discreet, that she kept things proper. In most parishes, godparents served as a means of binding families together, spreading obligation outward, ensuring that no child grew without a larger net of care. Here, the godparents are drawn from the same fence line, over and over. The same cousin sponsors one infant, then another, then a dozen more, until the role of spiritual guardian ceases to expand and collapses instead into repetition. What was meant as a safeguard becomes another layer of enclosure. Candle wax has dripped onto the register's margins, leaving hardened scars that obscure parts of names. The mildew smell lingers even now, a scent of stone walls that held moisture too long. One page in particular shows a smear where ink and wax met. The godparent's name is blurred into illegibility. Whether the smear came by accident or design is impossible to know. The priest wrote on regardless, his hand steady, as if the act of recording were more important than the truth it preserved. Whispers began in the village. Some suggested it was an effort to keep the estate from splintering, to bind land and lineage in the same knot. Others murmured about deformities, though no one spoke these things within earshot of the family. The pews were filled with their numbers, and their silence was weight enough to discourage any challenge. The priest himself said nothing from the pulpit. He dipped his quill into ink, wrote what was told to him, and turned the page. By the late 1830s, the pattern was undeniable. No outsider had sponsored a child in years. The ledger was a litany of sameness, each christening a mirror of the last. Where other parishes might have shown variety, this one grew narrow, its script coiling back on itself like a rope. The parish book survives, its pages brittle, its ink uneven but legible. Each line is an echo, a reminder that repetition can be its own form of silence. With every new baptism recorded, the community became quieter, until what might once have been spoken as suspicion was folded into ritual. The final effect is plain, but unspoken. The register does not record the growth of a community, only the narrowing of one, and in its quiet cadence, it leaves a question untouched. With every new line of ink, how much more did the parish choose not to know? The daybook is leather-bound, its cover softened by years of handling, its pages scored by a quill that pressed harder than it needed to. It was not meant for public eyes, only for the midwife who carried it from hearth to hearth. She used it to mark the nights she was summoned, the weather she traveled through, the phases of the moon. Most entries are no more than a line: male, breathing; female, weak; sometimes just a single word: gone. In the county, midwives were the true custodians of birth. Their records were rarely official, yet often more precise than the clerk's. They wrote not to satisfy institutions, but to remember patterns. When fevers came, when mothers failed, when infants clung on. This daybook follows that form, but with a constancy that unsettles. The same mother's name, again and again, stretching over 3 decades. By the time the midwife's hand began to tremble in her later years, she had recorded 47 births from that one house. The notatai. Bonds are clinical in their brevity. Familiar presentation, she writes more than once, shorthand for a body she had already delivered many times before. The phrase recurs often enough to seem mechanical, as though the act itself no longer required new description. Occasionally she noted traits: eyes uneven, palate narrow, small jaw. Yet she filed these remarks without elaboration, as though to linger would risk turning observation into accusation. It was common for midwives to use shorthand to spare space and effort. Still for stillborn, lab for labor, str for strong. But here the repetition feels heavier. The daybook shows no variety of surnames, no changing circle of women across the county, only the same mother, the same hearth. The pattern grows relentless, year after year, season after season, names identical, conditions echoing. On one page, the ink trails into a longer line than usual. She begins a sentence, features again. And then the page is torn, not cut, not clean, but ripped jaggedly so that the remainder is gone. The tear leaves a scar in the spine of the book. The next page resumes with the same brevity. Male, weak, familiar. That torn edge is louder than any entry she completed. It suggests a moment when the midwife almost stepped beyond her silence, then thought better, or was made to. Atmosphere surrounds the record. One can almost feel the cold of the nights she trudged through frost, candle in hand, leather satchel at her side. She would arrive at the compound, take her place at the bedside, and note the outcome by moonlight. The handwriting shows fatigue. Letters slope downward when she was called in the dead of night, steadier when written in morning light. The quill scratches betray her exhaustion, but not her reluctance. She wrote faithfully, even when the words risked repeating themselves into emptiness. By the 1850s, her entries are nearly indistinguishable from one another. Only the weather seems to change. Snow, rain, heat. Beneath, another line about a child from the same mother, the same father, the same familiar presentation. No ledger in the courthouse captured this relentless rhythm as clearly as the daybook. It is not official, but it is undeniable. The daybook closes with brittle leaves, the leather warped by years of damp. The final entry, dated in the late 1860s, reads simply, female, breathing, familiar. After that, the pages are blank. The book was put away in a chest, discovered decades later when the house had already been abandoned. The torn page remains its most eloquent feature. The absence speaks louder than the entries themselves, as if the truth the midwife almost allowed onto the paper was too heavy for the record to bear. What is removed from a page can be louder than what remains. The one-room schoolhouse stood at the edge of the settlement, a plain wooden structure with benches lined in rows, chalk dust clouding the air, and the sharp smell of pine boards cut rough. It was meant to be the great equalizer, where sons and daughters of farmers learned their letters beside the children of tradesmen. Yet the teacher's ledger from the 1840s reveals something else entirely, an environment where variety thinned until every hand, every voice, and every face seemed to repeat a single pattern. The copybooks tell the story first, open one at random, and the handwriting flows with neat slant, steady pressure, and identical spacing between letters. Open another, dated 10 years later, and the script is the same. Pupils separated by a decade, supposedly siblings but spread across generations, wrote with indistinguishable rhythm. The downstrokes pressed hard, the upstrokes lifted lightly, each page appearing as if copied from a master template. Teacher, as in rural schools, prided themselves on enforcing discipline in penmanship, yet here the discipline seemed to precede instruction. The line of ink already belonged to blood before it was trained by chalk. Recitation drills in the schoolhouse usually broke into a patchwork of voices, some hesitant, some eager, some falling behind. In the disciplinary log for this class, however, the entries are sparse. Few notations of disruption exist. Instead, a remark repeats, spelling in chorus. When asked to spell, the children responded together, their cadence so precise that it resembled rehearsal. Witnesses later remarked that it was impossible to tell which child had spoken first. The words seemed to rise from the benches as a single sound. Spelling bees, usually the highlight of a term, became rituals without suspense. One child answered, the next repeated, the next echoed. The teacher would try to catch them off guard with unusual words, orchard, dominion, melancholy. But the effect was the same. The voices arrived in unison, each syllable falling with the same weight, as though the answer had been drilled into them, not in class but in the walls of their own compound. Parent visits followed a pattern too. The school's log mentions visitors from Ridge on multiple occasions. The visitors were always the same two adults, never the mothers, never varied kin, only the same figures seated stiffly at the back of the room, silent but watchful. They did not speak during lessons, only nodded when the teacher dismissed the pupils. Their presence carried more weight than words. It was clear the teacher was being observed as much as the children were being taught. The atmosphere of the schoolhouse, as remembered in notes and fragments, carries its own unease. Chalkboards scratched with identical practice lines. Honor thy father. Practice makes perfect. The benches wore grooves from children who shifted restlessly, yet never raised their hands out of turn. The bell that marked each session swung steadily, but the silence within was heavier than the clang outside. In 19th century schools, teachers often used the McGuffey readers, books filled with moral lessons and simple prose. Pupils advanced unevenly, some mastering passages, others stumbling. In this classroom, however, the teacher noted a peculiarity. The younger children seemed to read passages fluently on their very first attempt, as though they had already rehearsed the words at home. The book was unnecessary. The lines were already known. Disciplinary records offer little contrast. A normal teacher's log would mention fights, disruptions, tardiness. Here the pages are almost bare. Only once does the teacher record hesitation, uneasy to hear all at once, no variety of error. After that, the log returns to silence. The schoolhouse still stands in fragments, its boards rotting, its benches long gone. Yet the documents remain. Identical copybooks stacked together, voices remembered for their sameness, and a teacher's reluctant note of unease. In most classrooms, learning created difference. Here it only refined repetition. When voices rhyme without rehearsal, what trained them? At first it was a single house, a weather-beaten cabin on a ridge that caught the wind, its chimney leaning, its boards warping with rain. But by the 1850s, what stood on Hollow Ridge was no longer a house. It had become a compound, each new addition tacked on like a rib to a chest, nailed hurriedly, with no thought of symmetry. A room for another child, then two more, a loft split into partitions. What had been a barn loft for hay was lined with straw pallets, and later with rope beds, each narrow and arranged in rows. The property lines began to stretch outward, not through official deeds but through whispered exchanges. Neighbors recalled that parcels of land simply shifted hands with no paper trail. A field once farmed by a tenant was suddenly being plowed by boys from the ridge. A woodlot queue by one farmer became timber stacked against the family's smokehouse. By the time anyone asked, no documentation could be found in the courthouse. Clerks shrugged. In a county where records were fragile, absence became ownership. Those who tried to settle nearby rarely stayed. New families leased land only to leave within a season. The accounts vary. Some cited noise from the compound, voices echoing at night as if the house itself rehearsed. Others mentioned livestock wandering unpenned, fences shifted or rebuilt without permission. A few spoke of directions given by children who carried ledgers under their arms, as though the boundaries of the ridge were their private map. Teenagers, not yet of age, were said to instruct neighbors where to plant, when to move stock, and which paths to avoid. The church pews filled with their surname. Entire benches were occupied by siblings and cousins who bowed their heads in the same rhythm. Outsiders who once occupied the back pews dwindled until the congregation resembled an extension of the household itself. The parish priest recorded no complaint, only notes of swelling attendance, though by then nearly every voice in hymn was the same. The compound itself reflected a kind of unchecked growth. Additions leaned on one another at odd angles, kitchen wings grafted onto smokehouses, porches enclosed into windowless rooms, ladders propped against lofts that had become sleeping chambers. Muddy paths ran between structures like veins. Animals crowded the yard, hogs rooting too near the walls, chickens scratching beneath steps, milk cows tethered close enough to lean against doorframes. The smell was said to carry down the ridge. Smoke, manure, and damp wood all mingled. Visitors described a sense of watchfulness. The house did not welcome, but surveyed. Windows were cut too high, shutters closed during the day, while children appeared in pairs at the edges of fields, keeping count of who passed. Neighbors mentioned rotating watches, though no authority ever confirmed such a system. What is certain is that strangers felt they were observed the moment they stepped within sight of the ridge. In rural America, compounds were rare but not unheard of. Extended families often clustered together, especially where land was abundant. Yet here the pattern was different. Instead of households branching outward into separate farms, all growth was drawn inward, absorbed into the central homestead. A village was being built, but it carried only one name, one blood. By the late 1860s, oral accounts agree that the compound housed more than 4 dozen children, their voices carrying through open windows in unison. No school teacher was needed. The lessons were conducted inside, and those who heard recitations from the yard swore it was impossible to tell whether the words belonged to 10 children or 50. The house still stood, but it no longer looked like a home. It resembled an organism, an expanding body that consumed every board, every acre, and every voice around it. A village can be built by one family if nobody else stays long enough to object. The census taker arrived in the heat of midsummer, coat already slung over one shoulder, hat pressed low against the glare. The ridge shimmered with dust, the air filled with the drone of insects. He carried a leather satchel, its brass clasp worn, and inside, the government forms, columns waiting to be filled with names, ages, occupations, and relationships. He had done this work before in neighboring districts. Households usually answered with hesitation, but with pride. A head of family, a wife, children listed in neat stair steps. This house was different. When he knocked the door, pinned to a flood of faces. Children crowded the threshold, their ages difficult to place, their features repeating until the distinctions blurred. The head of household appeared, gave his name, and gestured the children into lines. The enumerator unfolded his form, dipped his pen, and began. The first line was easy enough. Head, age 38. Occupation, farmer. The next line, wife, age 36. But then the column of minors stretched downward without pause. 23 names, everyone presented as child. The enumerator attempted to record relationships properly, yet the answers grew vague. Some were said to be sons, others nephews, others simply boarders. He wrote as he was told, though the use of boarder for children no older than 8 struck him as improbable. Ages formed an implausible pattern. Where he expected gaps of years, he found stair steps that made no sense. 2 children marked as 12, 3 as 9, 4 as 7. Several shared the same birthday, though their years of birth were different. The enumerator asked again, thinking perhaps he had misheard. The head of household repeated the dates firmly, and the children recited them in chorus. The pen moved across the page because there was no other option. Flies buzzed over the ink, drawn to the moisture, and the sun beat through the open shutters. The enumerator's pocket watch ticked, the sound sharp against the murmured responses. Sweat bled through his collar. He pressed on, his pen nib leaving blots where his hand shook. At times he thought the same child had been named twice, then realized it was a different one with the same face, the same uneven eyes. In the occupation column for older children, he wrote farm laborer, repeating it until the ink lost meaning. In relationship to head, he varied his entries: son, daughter, nephew, boarder. None satisfied him. By the end of the page, the column no longer resembled a family, but a catalogue of sameness forced into categories too fragile to contain it. When he finished, the enumerator signed his name and closed the ledger. But before he left, he pulled a smaller notebook from his pocket, the one not meant for submission, the one he used for reminders. There he wrote a single line in cramped script: same eyes, same hand. He underlined it once, then shut the book quickly as though afraid it might be read. Later, when the official records were filed, the household appeared ordinary by the standards of bureaucracy. A family of 30, mostly minors, recorded without comment. No clerk questioned the stair-step ages, the duplicate birthdays, the improbable number of boarders. Paper does not argue. It only holds ink. The private memo, however, remained hidden until the enumerator's effects were inventoried after his death. It was found folded among receipts, fragile as a leaf. The house on Hollow Ridge gave the government what it demanded: numbers in boxes, names in columns. Yet the truth did not fit those lines. The census taker learned that a form can only stretch so far before it fails to capture what it sees. When a government form cannot hold a family, the family will hold itself. The physician came in winter, summoned by a messenger who rode out from Hollow Ridge before dawn. The frost clung to the ruts of the road, and by the time the doctor arrived, his horse's breath clouded in the air like smoke. He carried a satchel of instruments, though little was needed beyond his eyes, his hands, and his ledger. Rural medicine in the 1850s relied as much on observation as on cure. Inside the parlor, an oil lamp hissed, casting light across walls roughened by smoke. The children were assembled in order from eldest to youngest, each silent as they waited for examination. They did not fidget or protest. They stood with hands clasped, faces tilted toward the glow, their features echoing from one to the next. The physician began with the mouth. One after another, he instructed them to open wide. He noted high-arched palates, a trait repeated so often it seemed less anomaly than standard. He ran his fingers along teeth, finding the same misalignment in child after child, lower incisors angled forward, upper canines crowding in. He asked each to breathe, to cough, to stretch their arms. In 3 cases, he traced an extra rib beneath the skin, a subtle ridge that should not have been there. Field notes were written on folded paper in tight script. But where other doctors might have sought cause or explanation, this one chose caution. He wrote only familial tendency, a phrase vague enough to mean nothing yet precise enough to suggest pattern. It was a physician's shield, a way to record without accusing, to acknowledge without naming. The words repeated in his notes like a refrain. He knew the risks of saying more. To write consanguinity was to condemn, to turn quiet knowledge into public scandal. Such words traveled quickly, finding their way into court petitions or church sermons. So instead, the doctor closed his ledger each night with blank spaces where diagnosis should have been. He left the silences for others to interpret. When pressed about remedies, he offered little beyond a recommendation. Limit unions to outside stock. He wrote the phrase once, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. It was a clinical suggestion, agricultural in its tone, but it carried no enforcement. The family ignored it. Compensation was arranged in livestock. A calf for his trouble, some chickens for repeated visits, no coin changed hands, without a bill, no trace entered county records. The transactions vanished into barter, leaving only the physician's private notes as evidence. The house remained cold. Frost spread across window panes, and the breath of the assembled children fogged in lamplight. The doctor worked steadily, though his hand grew slower as the examinations continued. He seemed to realize that each child was less an individual case than a repetition. His notes became shorter, his descriptions clipped. By the final page, he had reduced entire examinations to 2 words: familiar type. When he left, he packed his satchel and accepted the calf tethered outside, its hooves slipping on the frozen ground. He rode away with no official report to file, only the folded pages in his pocket. In the county courthouse, no entry records his visit. In parish archives, no sermon speaks his warning. What remains is the silence of the medical ledger, silence carefully chosen, silence that preserved the family as it was. For doctors of the time, omission could be as decisive as cure. A word withheld meant a life unexamined, a household left to its own design. What a doctor will not write can be more useful than what he can. It began in a barn, not a courthouse. Neighbors gathered in late autumn, their voices lowered against the creak of rafters, the smell of hay pressing close. They had watched the compound on Hollow Ridge grow for years, watched the pews fill with one name, watched their children return from school uneasy. What had been whispers hardened into ink. A petition was drafted, urging the magistrate to intervene, not in violence, but in oversight. Schooling, land distribution, moral example. 3 reasons written plainly, though the meaning was sharper than the words aloud. The document itself survives, folded arm wrong, and spotted with candle soot. Its first lines follow the pattern of the time. We, the undersigned citizens of the county, do humbly petition. 22 signatures fill the page, names lined in uneven hands, yet the same paper shows another layer. More than half the names crossed out in a different ink in a steadier hand. Some are struck through so heavily the parchment has thinned. Others are marked with a simple line, as if the signer had recanted under watchful eyes. Those who signed had reason for caution. The magistrate's own clerk had married into a cousin branch of the family on Hollow Ridge. To complain was to risk lodging objection against kin, and kinship in the 19th century outweighed the formal lines of law. Neighbors knew this, yet still they signed, as though the act of committing names to paper was itself a form of resistance. The petition was sealed with red wax and delivered by hand to the county seat. It did not travel far. Within weeks it returned, the envelope unopened, a rubber stamp pressed across its face. Improper jurisdiction. No explanation accompanied the dismissal. The paper carried its own refusal. The seal remained intact, unbroken, as though the magistrate had chosen blindness rather than acknowledgement. In the county records, the petition is filed under a category that appears again and again in moments of discomfort: miscellaneous, no action. The drawer holds all manner of unresolved appeals, boundary disputes abandoned, complaints of livestock theft without evidence, petitions too politically sensitive to pursue. This one joins them, folded neatly, stripped of urgency. For the neighbors, the return was worse than silence. To have spoken and been unheard is one thing. To have spoken and been deliberately refused is another. Some who had signed withdrew from public life, their names already crossed from the page before the magistrates. E's stamp made it official. The act of striking through a name became its own form of punishment, leaving a trace of betrayal more lasting than the original signature. Meetings in barns ceased. Conversations at fences grew shorter. Those who had once objected aloud now muttered in private, unwilling to see their words returned stamped again. The family on Hollow Ridge carried on undisturbed. Their pews remained full, their fields extended. If they knew of the petition, they never acknowledged it. Petitions in the 19th century were tools of community, ways for ordinary citizens to push institutions toward action. Yet institutions fail gently first, by misfiling what they fear to confront. A stamp, a drawer, a label marked miscellaneous. These are the bureaucratic equivalents of looking away. The magistrate did not condemn, nor did he absolve. He simply refused to see. The petition paper still bears its layers of ink, the signatures, the crossouts, the stamp. It is a record less of complaint than of collapse, an attempted intervention that dissolved the moment it touched authority. Institutions fail gently first, by misfiling what they fear to confront. In the summer of 1873, a photographer arrived on Hollow Ridge. He traveled with a wagon, his equipment packed in padded cases, a brass-bound camera, a collapsible tripod, trays of chemicals, and glass plates fragile as ice. He offered what few in the county had, the chance to see oneself fixed in silver. Families dressed in their best lined themselves stiffly before painted backdrops and purchased likenesses to send eastward. It was a practice that turned memory into commodity, evidence into artifact. On Hollow Ridge, the photographer set his tripod in dust that lifted with each step. He arranged his backdrop, a painted canvas of columns and drapery already sun-faded, and instructed the family to stand in rows. The adults in back, the children seated in front, all faces tilted toward the pale oval of the lens. He adjusted for light, but the sun refused to cooperate. Shadows collapsed. Auteurs blurred, the repetition of faces confusing his eye. The first plate developed poorly. He noted it in his ledger. Trouble with shadows, too similar. He tried again, longer exposure, ordering the children to hold still. Yet still the image resisted distinction. Where he expected variety, lines of age, play of expression, he found only echoes. Eyes mirrored eyes, mouths mirrored mouths. In the image, individuality thinned until what remained was pattern, as though one face had been imprinted across dozens of bodies. Albumin prints of the time carried a soft sheen, a gloss that lent dignity to even the poorest subjects. But this plate seemed to betray the process. The shadows pooled unnaturally, swallowing the slight differences the camera might have captured. When the photograph emerged, it looked less like a family than a duplication, a single form repeated. The photographer sold only one print. His ledger records it under a simple line, Hollow Ridge Family, c. 1873. There are no prices listed beside it, no additional copies ordered. Most families purchase several, gifts for kin, tokens for friends, but not here. The family kept the only intact print. No one else asked to see it. Later, the plate itself cracked, whether from mishandling, heat, or some stress in the glass. It split diagonally, leaving the image fractured. One half showed the adults standing rigid, the other half the children seated beneath them. The break seemed almost deliberate, dividing the generations but preserving the sameness across both. The cracked plate was discarded, its shards packed away, while the single surviving print remained on Hollow Ridge. Photography was meant to clarify, to capture what the eye might miss. Yet in this case, it revealed too much. A picture that should have distinguished faces flattened them instead. In its forensic plainness, it offered evidence of what Boers already whispered but did not name, repetition made visible. Traveling photographers often moved quickly, their ledgers brief. Yet his notes linger on this entry. Too similar. It is not a phrase of complaint, but of unease, the kind that suggests the lens recorded what the mind did not want to confirm. Today the print is lost, presumed destroyed when the compound fell to ruin. Only the cracked plate fragments and the ledger survive in archives. They tell a story not through what they depict, but through what they failed to. The impossibility of capturing difference where little existed to begin with. A photograph is expected to fix truth, but sometimes truth resists framing. On Hollow Ridge, the camera did not preserve identity. It erased it. A picture may tell the truth too plainly to be kept whole. Among the fragments salvaged from Hollow Ridge, one book stands apart from daybooks of births or account tallies. It is a ledger of courtships, kept not for trade, but for containment. The cover is plain, its spine cracked, its corners worn by repeated handling. Inside, names are listed in pencil, each belonging to someone from outside the compound. A schoolmate, a farmhand, a tenant from a neighboring lot. 10 names appear. 9 are crossed out with a single line, and beside them, in smaller script, the word ended. At first glance, the ledger mimics the pattern of a merchant's account, as though daughters or sons were entries in an exchange. But what is being recorded here is not transaction completed, but transaction denied. Each line begins with the name of an outsider, followed by an offer or note of dowry. Livestock is most common. 1 cow, 2 calves, team of oxen. Labor is listed too. 3 months in mill, clearing of fields. Coin appears only once, a small sum quickly struck through. Every courtship ends abruptly. The line of pencil stops short, and the outsider's name is marked out. 9 times the strike is firm, fin. All as if no reconsideration was possible. One name is different. Rather than struck, it is marked resolved. No explanation follows. No margin note clarifies whether resolution meant marriage, departure, or disappearance. The word stands alone, heavy in its ambiguity. In the margin of several entries, a hand has written the same phrase, faint but legible. Keep the line. It is not clear whether this was meant as instruction or warning, but it appears often enough to define the ledger's purpose. Courtship was permitted only insofar as it proved futile. Outsiders could be entertained, their offers measured, their names inscribed, but always the conclusion was the same. The line remained closed. Neighbors recalled suppers at the compound, evenings when a suitor would arrive hopeful, seated at a long table crowded with kin. He would leave with little explanation, his interest dissolved by nightfall. Some never returned. A few who did were said to have spoken of unease, the silence of too many eyes fixed on them, the sensation of being counted rather than welcomed. None of their accounts made it into official record. The ledger absorbed them instead, reducing their presence to a name and a cross-out. The book itself bears the marks of handling. Dog-eared pages, smudged graphite where fingers rubbed over notes. Several entries are faint, as if erased and rewritten, the same name tried twice before being struck. Unlike parish registers or census forms, this ledger was private, kept on a wooden table inside the compound, updated by hand in the dim light of an oil lamp. In the 19th century, marriage ledgers often functioned as family records, tracing alliances and dowries exchanged. On Hollow Ridge, the practice inverted. Instead of expanding the family outward, the ledger folded every attempt inward, ensuring no outsider could anchor themselves within. It is less a book of unions than of exclusions, a catalogue of doors closed. By the end of its entries, the pattern is unmistakable. Names tried on like borrowed coats, then discarded, their threads pulled loose. The lone resolved remains as an unanswered question, an exception or a warning left deliberately unclear. What does a family fear losing when it refuses to open its door? The ledger offers only silence in reply, its pencil strokes lighter with time, its margins repeating the same command. Keep the line. The winter of 1876 was brittle, the kind where frost etched every window pane and wood split in the firebox. On Hollow Ridge, the smoke from chimneys rose thin and weak, carrying less warmth than signal. A fever had moved through the rooms, quiet at first, then steady, until it gripped the household entire. Neighbors noticed the absence before they heard the whispers. Children who usually passed on the road no longer appeared. The school benches sat half empty, the pews filled with gaps. In the parish death register, the first entry is unremarkable. Female child, age 6. Cause, catarrh. The second comes days later. Male, 9. Cause, weakness. Then the lines fall closer together, as though the clerk had no time to recover between reports. The pages fill with repetition, the same surname crowding the column, until the register itself begins to resemble a household ledger rather than a parish book. Then, abruptly, the entries stop. Not because the fever passed, but because the deaths left the churchyard. The burials shifted to the soil beyond the compound's gate. The sexton's notes survive in fragments. Private interments, no stones. He wrote it with reluctance, a phrase that marks refusal as much as fact. Without stones, graves vanish into ground, leaving no line for future eyes to follow. The midwife's daybook, which had carried decades of terse notations, records one last line for that season. Ground frozen, boys dug at night, no names, no numbers, only the detail of frozen soil and the children pressed into labor with shovels. The words are final in their sparseness. After that, her hand never appears in record again. Neighbors recalled seeing lanterns flicker on the ridge after midnight, moving slowly, then vanishing. No bells tolled, though the parish traditionally rang for every death, no matter how poor the family. The silence of bells carried farther than sound. In the stillness of that winter, silence itself became announcement. Fever in the 19th century was not uncommon. Catarrh, influenza, scarlet fever, all could pass through a household in days. Yet rarely did they remove so many without leaving stone or sermon. Most parishes relied on ritual to carry memory. Bells, processions, carved names. Here, absence was chosen over ritual. Children were lowered into unmarked soil, one after another, until even counting became uncertain. By spring, the compound appeared intact again. Voices returned to the pews, fields were worked, livestock tended. No record marks the number of those gone. No ledger tallies how many were lowered into frozen ground. Only the gaps in pages, the silence of bells, and the sexton's brief note remain. The parish register resumes months later with new entries, births, and baptisms that continued the pattern. The deaths that winter became a blank seam, an absence folded neatly between one season and the next. For institutions, what is not written cannot be contested. For families, what is buried without stone cannot be counted. In archives, the cluster of names ends abruptly, leaving historians to guess at the toll. Some estimate a dozen, others more. The truth lies beneath unmarked earth, beneath fields long plowed, beneath soil that never bore inscription. Graves that leave no names make his, Tory that leaves no lessons. In 1881, a bond was filed at the county courthouse, its edges crisp, its ink still fresh. It bore the name of a daughter from Hollow Ridge, the only daughter known to have stepped forward in such a way. Her intended was a farmhand from the next county, an ordinary match by rural standards. He worked with livestock, earned steady wages, and by all accounts sought a modest life. For a moment, the ledger of the county suggested that the line on Hollow Ridge might finally open. Marriage bonds in the 19th century were public instruments. They were nailed to the courthouse wall or posted in church so that any objection might surface before vows were spoken. The girl's name appeared there, visible to all, paired with the farmhand's. For a week, the bond stood without comment. Then, suddenly, it was removed. The clerk's record shows it voided, no reason supplied, only a blank in the margin where explanation should have been. The farmhand left soon after. His employer later received an anonymous note questioning the man's character. The handwriting was careful, the words vague, but the effect was decisive. Rumor spread that the match was unfit, though no evidence followed. Within months, the man had left the county altogether. His name never reappeared in local records. The daughter, meanwhile, vanished back into the compound. A year later, her name surfaced again, not on a marriage certificate, but on a baptism roll, written as godmother to another infant born under the same surname. What might have been her own child, had the bond held, was instead a role of witness inside the same circle she had tried to leave. Court documents confirm the bond's existence, but its erasure is more telling. Bonds were not rescinded lightly. They carried the force of contract. To void one without explanation suggests interference beyond ordinary cause. Clerks at the time had little reason to question family pressure or quiet threats. A crossed-out line could be as final as a grave. Within the household, her role was reassigned. Notes from neighbors describe her as housekeeper, nursery, tending to children not her own, keeping order in the compound's inner rooms. She was neither wife nor mother in the formal sense, yet bound by duty all the same. The door she had reached for closed, and when it shut, it sealed her within tasks that required her presence, but denied her independence. Marriage, in most rural communities, was a bridge outward, a means of joining land, names, and fortunes. On Hollow Ridge, it became instead a point of fracture. When one daughter reached across the boundary, the family recoiled, drawing her back as quickly as possible. The bond stood only long enough to prove what was forbidden. The courthouse corridor where the bond was once posted held its silence. Other papers fluttered on the wall, licenses that led to weddings, contracts that bound new names into the county fabric. Only hers was pulled down, leaving behind the faint mark of nail and parchment. The absence carried its own kind of weight, a void in a place meant for public record. In time, even that trace faded. The girl's life was not recorded in further bonds or licenses. Only the baptism roll, the parish book, and the household chores assigned to her remained. Her attempt at departure became one more line folded back into the family's pattern. A door may open briefly, just to prove it was never meant to be used. In the county seat, where dust clung to windowsills and ink dried slower in the heat, a clerk worked quietly at his desk. His task was not to judge, but to file petitions, affidavits, licenses, reports. He handled them with the steady rhythm of a man who understood that paper was both shield and burden. Over time, certain documents accumulated, ones that could not be properly categorized, that seemed to weigh heavier than their pages allowed. The clerk began to gather them into a single folder. It bore no title, no county stamp, no indication of contents. Only a thumb-shaped oil stain marked its cover, a trace from the hand that pressed it closed too often. Into this folder went loose affidavits about Hollow Ridge, unsigned statements scribbled on scrap, petitions with too many names crossed through. One note in particular repeated the phrase, "Sameness as danger." Another declared, without attribution, they are no longer separate people. Ordinarily, documents carried formality, signatures, seals, witnesses. These did not. They came folded without envelopes or passed across desks with a glance that discouraged questions. None met the requirements for official action. Yet the clerk could not discard them. To throw them away would have been to acknowledge their threat. To file them publicly would have been to provoke inquiry. So he chose a third path, concealment through preservation. County filing systems in the 19th century relied on drawers divided by category: deeds, licenses, petitions, court orders. At the bottom sat the drawers marked miscellaneous, repositories for what did not fit. The clerk slid his folder into one of these, pushed it deep, and turned a brass key in the lock. The click echoed softly in the office, a sound of conclusion rather than resolution. Dust gathered quickly in such places. The folder lay flat, forgotten amid routine business. Above it, other documents shuffled endlessly: tax disputes, livestock theft, petty quarrels. But the unlabeled folder remained untouched, its contents neither destroyed nor acknowledged. For 20 years, it would not be opened. The clerk retired without comment. When his belongings were inventoried, the brass key was missing. No replacement was made. The bottom drawer stayed locked, its existence noted only in passing by those who later occupied the desk. By then, memory of Hollow Ridge had already grown faint, spoken more as rumor than as record. Yet the folder remained, waiting. Inside were the small fragments that resisted erasure: affidavits warning of repetition, petitions urging intervention, anonymous accounts of unease. Their silence was louder for being unsigned. They were not strong enough to force action, but too sharp to be discarded. Clerks often left marginal notes in county books, reminders for themselves or for successors. In one margin near the Hollow Ridge petitions, a hand wrote, "See drawer." Nothing more. It is the only surviving clue that the folder existed at all. In archives today, the folder is considered anomalous, neither official nor private, both evidence and avoidance. It survived not because the institution acknowledged it, but because one clerk chose not to let it vanish. In his restraint, he ensured that silence did not become obliteration. If the record must survive, sometimes it must do so hidden. And in a bottom drawer, marked only by an oil stain, the story of Hollow Ridge endured in the shadows, where authority dared not look. In the parish register of 1891, the priest's handwriting falters. The column of baptisms, usually filled with names carefully inscribed, ends with a line that breaks the pattern. Where the infant's name should stand, the space is left blank. In its place, the priest writes only, "Another of the same." The words tilt so lightly, as though his hand shook in the moment, the ink blots at the corner of the page spreading into the fibers. It is the last explicit reference to Hollow Ridge. For decades, the baptismal roll had repeated the same pairing of parents, the same surname written over and over until it seemed less like record than refrain. Each christening had followed custom. Child held at the font, godparents standing witness, names entered into the book by steady clerical hand. But this time the ritual fractured. The priest could not, or would not, commit another name to the page. The parish church was lit only by candles. Wax had built up along the altar, hardened into ridges like stalactites. The air carried the damp of stone walls. In that silence, the act of withholding a name became louder than a sermon. Parishioners recalled no homily that day about sin or shame. Instead, they remembered the priest's voice, thin. The service hurried, his eyes lowered to the book rather than lifted to the congregation. After this, the register changes. The familiar surname fades from its columns. In the following years, baptisms shift to children of newcomers, families drawn from the turnpike trade, farmhands arriving from other counties. The parish begins to diversify again, its pews no longer dominated by one line. Yet the memory of Hollow Ridge remains as absence, an echo rather than a presence. Oral accounts suggest the births did not stop. Neighbors spoke of cries heard at night, of small graves dug without stone or prayer. Some whispered of stillbirths, more frequent than before, though no records confirmed them. The initials of the midwife, once so constant in parish ledgers, vanish entirely. Whether she died, withdrew, or was silenced is unknown. Her absence coincides with the parish's sudden quiet. The handwriting itself tells the story. Priests were trained in a practiced script, letters upright, strokes firm. Yet by 1891, the hand trembles, the lines uneven. Scholars who examine the book note fatigue, perhaps reluctance. The blank left for the name is intentional. The phrase, another of the same, is not clerical shorthand, but judgment, a refusal to repeat what had already filled too many pages. Baptism was meant to anchor children in community, binding them to godparents, parish, and faith. To omit a name was to unmoor a child from that structure, consigning them to record without identity. The priest's act transformed the register into something closer to testimony than tradition. By the close of the decade, the parish roll is thin. Fewer baptisms appear each year, yet those that do belong to families unconnected to Hollow Ridge. The silence around the compound deepens. Where once the parish book documented every child in that house, it now bears only the mark of erasure. The register still exists, brittle and browned, its ink fading, but legible. The page with the trembling line remains the hinge of the record, the moment when routine failed, when repetition could no longer be sustained. When a line can no longer widen, it thins, and then it breaks. By the turn of the century, the census takers reached Hollow Ridge and found nothing. The forms, still brittle in their columns, list the ridge under a single word: vacant. No households, no names, no occupations. Where once an enumerator had bent his hand to record a family too large for his ledger, there was now only a blank. It is the kind of entry that hides more than it reveals, absence presented as fact. A year later, county records mention the house. It appears in a property assessment, marked as burned, no cause recorded. The structure that had spread across the ridge like an organism was reduced to ash. No investigation followed. In the courthouse files, the line of explanation ends there. The absence is left to stand as sufficient. The land itself did not remain untouched. Timber companies moved in, buying parcels in blocks. Property that had been worked for decades without deed or clear claim was sold off in a series of transactions, each signed not by heirs but by agents. No family member came forward. No dispute was filed. The land passed from local soil into distant ledgers, its value extracted as wood. In the parish, no stones were ever carved. The graveyard bears no markers of the names that once filled every pew. Soil remembers what marble does not. Oral accounts tell of unmarked mounds in frozen winters, of lanterns moving across the ridge at night, but nothing permanent anchors those memories. The parish registers thin, their ink faltering, until even the priest's final trembling hand no longer appears. For decades, the story of Hollow Ridge lingered only as rumor, passed in fragments. The children who answered in unison, the marriages that never left the compound, the fever that claimed too many without bells. Without records, rumor hardened into folklore. Then, in the 1920s, an archivist cataloging county papers opened a locked drawer, long left untouched. Inside, he found the unlabeled folder, the one marked only by a thumb-shaped oil stain. Its contents were thin, no more than a dozen pages, but heavy with implication. Petitions with signatures struck through, affidavits unsigned. Notes written in margins, sameness is danger. They matched not the official history, but the whispered one. The archivist filed them properly at last, though in doing so, he transformed rumor into archive. The folder became evidence, however incomplete. It proved that the family had not vanished without trace, but had been deliberately contained in silence, kept off pages, erased from stones, folded into drawers that no one opened until memory had already collapsed. To read the folder now is to confront the limits of record-keeping. Officially, Hollow Ridge burned. Officially, the ridge was vacant. Yet the documents hidden in the drawer reveal the weight of what institutions refuse to say. In their sparseness, they testify more than a ledger of names ever could. The ridge itself is bare. No house remains, no fence line, no stones. Only the soil, and beneath it, what cannot be tallied. In archives, the folder rests with its oil stain darkened by time, its pages fragile but legible. If a family writes only itself, how many signatures does it take before the archive becomes a mirror? By the turn of the century, Hollow Ridge was ash and vacancy. The census pages left the space blank, the courthouse gave no cause for the fire, and the parish marked no stone for the dead. What remains are only fragments, a torn midwife's page, a cracked photograph, a priest's trembling hand writing another of the same. History records what it can, and erases what it fears. But in that erasure lies its own testimony. The Hollow Ridge family did not vanish. They were folded into silence, leaving behind a trail of absences that speak louder than names. If a family writes only itself, how many signatures does it take before the archive becomes a mirror? Thank you for joining me in the search through these forgotten pages. If you want more histories like this, stories of erasure, silence, and the macabre truths hidden in America's past, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what history tried to bury. And now I want to know from you. If you had stood in that courthouse and seen those signatures, brother and sister side by side, would you have spoken up or looked away as everyone else did? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember, what we inherit from the past is not always truth, but the quiet weight of what was left unwritten.